The massive harvester machines worked like hungry metal beasts across the Zephyrian homeworld. Their enormous drills tore through mountains while giant vacuum tubes sucked away chunks of atmosphere into their processing centers. The sky had turned a sickly orange color as the machines stripped away the protective layers that had kept the planet safe for millions of years. Commander Vextel stood on the observation deck of the last remaining orbital station, watching his beautiful world slowly die. His green, bark-like skin had turned pale with fear and exhaustion. The Zephyrians looked like walking trees with intelligent eyes, and they had lived in peace for thousands of years. They grew their cities instead of building them, shaped living wood into spacecraft, and had never hurt another living being in their entire history. But now the harvesters had found them. These terrible machines traveled from world to world, eating everything they found. They turned planets into raw materials, stripping away soil, water, air, and even the creatures living there. Nothing was safe from their endless hunger. The communication officer, a young Zephyrian named Kilvar, looked up from his station with tears flowing down his wooden face. "Commander, our last defense satellite just went dark. The machines destroyed it with some kind of energy beam." Vextel watched as the final satellite exploded in a burst of orange flame. That satellite had been their great-grandfather's final gift to the planet, grown from a seed that had taken 50 years to mature into a living defense system. Now it was just burning debris, floating in space. "Send the message," Vextel said quietly. "Broadcast it on all frequencies, all languages, every communication channel we know." The desperate transmission began reaching across the stars. The Zephyrians offered their most valuable treasure, crystallized time energy, to anyone who might help them. This energy could power entire civilizations for centuries. But what good was treasure when your entire species was about to become extinct? Across the galaxy, different alien species received the message. The proud Altarians, who looked like golden lions standing on two legs, discussed it in their council chambers. They decided the Zephyrians were already doomed, and helping them would only waste good soldiers. The crystal-based Vortians, whose bodies sparkled like living diamonds, calculated the odds of victory and found them too low to risk their fleets. Even the war-loving Kraken's fierce creatures covered in natural armor shook their heads and called the situation hopeless. But the message traveled farther than anyone expected. It bounced off communication satellites, passed through space stations, and finally reached a small blue planet on the edge of a quiet spiral arm. The beings living there called their world Earth. Admiral Jake Morrison was having a perfectly normal Tuesday morning, watching his fleet practice formation flying near Jupiter. The massive gas giant hung in space like a striped marble, while human warships moved around it in precise patterns. Morrison had been in the space fleet for 20 years, and he loved the beauty of ships moving together like a deadly dance. Lieutenant Amy Parker was the youngest officer on the bridge, fresh out of the academy with bright eyes and quick fingers on the communication controls. She had been tracking alien radio signals for months as part of a secret project to learn about their galactic neighbors. Admiral Amy called out, her voice tight with excitement. "I'm getting something strange on the long-range channels. It sounds like aliens, but they're speaking really fast, and they sound scared." Morrison walked over to her station, coffee mug still in his hand. The translation computer was working overtime, turning alien sounds into English words that appeared on the screen. As he read the message, his coffee grew cold. The aliens were dying. Some kind of machine army was eating their planet, and they had maybe a week left before everything they had ever built would be gone forever. They were offering everything they owned to anyone brave enough to help them fight. Morrison sat down his coffee mug and looked out at the human fleet practicing their maneuvers. 47 warships, each one built by people who had survived ice ages, world wars, and every natural disaster their dangerous planet could throw at them. These ships were crewed by humans who had climbed out of caves, built cities, reached for the stars, and never stopped fighting for what they believed was right. "Amy," Morrison said calmly, "send a message to Earth Command. Tell them we've got first contact with hostile aliens, and some friendly ones who need our help." He paused, watching Jupiter's great red spots swirl like a storm that had been raging for centuries. "Then ready the fleet for combat operations. Looks like we're going to war." The moment Admiral Morrison's message reached Earth Command, something incredible happened. Within minutes, every military base on the planet was buzzing with activity. Soldiers who had been eating lunch dropped their sandwiches and ran to their stations. Pilots sleeping in their bunks jumped up and started pre-flight checks. Engineers working on routine repairs suddenly found themselves installing weapons on ships that had never seen combat. But it wasn't just the military that responded. When news leaked that aliens were under attack and needed help, something deep in human nature woke up. Civilian ships started appearing at military bases, their captains demanding to be part of the rescue mission. Mining companies offered their huge industrial vessels. Research stations volunteered their experimental weapons. Even cruise ships asked if they could help evacuate alien refugees. Captain Tom Bradley stood on the bridge of the Retribution, watching technicians load the last of his nuclear warheads into the ship's missile bays. His vessel was built like a flying fortress, with armor thick enough to survive direct hits from enemy weapons. The nuclear arsenal he carried could turn an entire moon into glowing dust, but Bradley hoped he wouldn't need to use all of it. "Captain," his weapons officer called out, "we've got enough firepower to fight a small war by ourselves." Bradley grinned. "Good thing we're not going alone." Next to the Retribution, Captain Lisa Murphy's ship Iron Storm was preparing for a different kind of fight. Her vessel carried special pods designed to punch through enemy ship holes, allowing human soldiers to board hostile vessels in the middle of space battles. Murphy's crew were experts at fighting in the darkness of space, where there was no air to breathe, and one small mistake could mean floating in the void forever. The most amazing thing was how fast everything came together. The biggest mining ship in the solar system, normally used for breaking apart asteroids, had been fitted with weapons in just 4 hours. Research stations that usually studied peaceful things like star formation were now mounting experimental laser cannons that had never been tested in real combat. Even old cargo haulers were being loaded with supplies and medical equipment for treating wounded aliens they had never seen before. Dr. Rachel Thompson, who normally studied plant diseases, found herself working frantically to modify human medical equipment for alien biology. She had never imagined she would be preparing to save the lives of tree-like creatures from another world. But she worked without stopping for 18 straight hours to get ready. Meanwhile, in shipyards across Earth, workers were performing miracles. Ships that should have taken months to prepare were ready in hours. Weapons that had never been installed before were mounted and tested in record time. Even civilian volunteers with no military training were learning how to operate emergency systems and help with basic ship functions. The most surprising volunteers came from unexpected places. Retired veterans who hadn't flown in decades climbed back into pilot seats. Scientists who had spent their whole careers studying peaceful things started calculating the best ways to destroy enemy machines. Even teenagers too young for military service begged to help in any way they could. As the massive human fleet gathered near Earth's moon, something became clear that no alien species had ever understood about humans. When faced with innocent people being hurt, humans didn't calculate odds or worry about profit. They didn't form committees or debate for months about whether to help. They just grabbed the biggest weapons they could find and went to fight the bullies. Admiral Morrison looked out at the assembled armada and felt proud of his species. Over 150 ships floated in formation. Everything from sleek military destroyers to ugly industrial vessels that had been turned into impromptu warships. Some of the civilian ships looked ridiculous with weapons bolted onto their hulls in awkward places. But they were there because their crews couldn't stand the thought of innocent aliens dying while they did nothing. 3 star systems away, Commander. Vextel watched his sensor screens with growing amazement and terror. The energy readings approaching his system were unlike anything in galactic history. Most species sent small exploration fleets, or maybe a few dozen warships to investigate new situations. But the humans were bringing enough firepower to fight the entire galactic empire. Commander, his sensor operator whispered, these readings suggest they have enough weapons to destroy our entire solar system. Are we sure they're coming to help us? Vextel stared at the data, trying to understand what kind of species responded to a cry for help by bringing an invasion fleet. But then he remembered the desperate situation his people faced. The Harvesters were only days away from finishing their destruction of the Zephyrian homeworld. Maybe it would take something as crazy as these humans to have any chance of stopping the unstoppable machines. I don't know what they are, Vextel said quietly, but they're our only hope. The space around the Zephyrian homeworld looked like a mechanical nightmare. 12 enormous harvester ships, each one the size of a small city, hung in the darkness like metal vultures. Their massive drilling arms were tearing chunks out of the planet's moon, feeding the rocky material into giant processing centers that glowed with hellish red light. Smaller harvester drones swarmed around the main ships like angry wasps, carrying loads of stolen materials back and forth. Then the humans arrived, and everything changed in an instant. The human fleet didn't emerge from hyperspace in neat formations like most civilized species would. Instead, they appeared scattered across the battlefield in what looked like complete chaos. But there was method to their madness. Each human ship had chosen its target before they even arrived, and they came out of hyperspace already shooting. Admiral Morrison's voice crackled across all communication channels with the kind of calm confidence that made hardened soldiers feel invincible. All right, people, we've got some mechanical bullies picking on our new friends. Time to teach them some manners. Captain Tom Bradley didn't hesitate for even a second. The moment his ship Retribution dropped out of hyperspace, he pointed it straight at the nearest harvester dreadnought and pushed his engines to maximum power. His crew grabbed onto whatever they could find as their ship accelerated toward what looked like certain death. Captain, are you seriously going to ram that thing? His navigator asked, staring at the massive enemy vessel growing larger in their view screen. Sometimes the old ways are the best ways, Bradley replied with a grin. Just before his reinforced warship slammed into the harvester vessel like a giant hammer. The impact was incredible. The Retribution's specially strengthened hull, designed to survive the worst battles humanity could imagine, punched through the enemy's armor like it was made of cardboard. Pieces of alien machinery went flying in all directions as the human ship carved a path deep into the enemy vessel, before finally coming to a stop inside what looked like a massive factory floor. At the same time, Captain Lisa Murphy was launching her own kind of attack. Her ship Iron Storm fired dozens of boarding pods toward different harvester vessels. Each pod was filled with human marines, wearing powered armor and carrying enough weapons to level a small building. The pods slammed into the enemy ships and immediately began burning through the hulls with plasma cutters. Sergeant Mike Davis was the first human to step inside a harvester ship, and what he found there made his blood run cold. The corridors were filled with mechanical processing units that were doing something horrible to captured Zephyrian civilians. The tree-like aliens were being connected to machines that were slowly converting them into mechanical parts for the Harvester Collective. "This is sick," Davis said into his radio, watching a Zephyrian child crying as mechanical arms tried to attach cybernetic implants to his wooden skin. "These things aren't just killing people. They're turning them into spare parts." Davis and his squad immediately began shooting every machine they could see. They used explosive charges to blast through mechanical barriers and plasma rifles to melt processing units. When they ran out of ammunition, They used crowbars and hammers to smash whatever was left. The Zephyrian prisoners looked at these strange, pink creatures with amazement as the humans tore apart their mechanical captors with their bare hands. Meanwhile, other human ships were using tactics that made absolutely no sense to anyone watching. Mining vessels designed for breaking apart asteroids were ramming harvester ships and then using their industrial cutting beams to slice enemy vessels in half. Research ships with experimental weapons were firing energy beams that no one had ever tested in combat before. Even converted cargo haulers were getting into the fight, using their loading cranes to grab smaller harvester drones and smash them against larger ships. The most shocking thing to the Zephyrians was how much the humans seemed to be enjoying themselves. Battle communications were filled with laughter and jokes as human crews faced certain death with the kind of casual attitude most people reserved for weekend sports. "Hey Murphy," Captain Bradley called over the radio while his ship was still stuck inside the enemy vessel. "I think I'm going to need a tow truck when this is over." "No problem, Tom," Murphy replied, while her Marines were fighting hand-to-hand with mechanical constructs. "I'll add it to your repair bill." Commander Vextel watched all of this from his observation station, unable to believe what he was seeing. The harvesters had been designed by an ancient machine intelligence to be the perfect military force. They calculated optimal strategies, used overwhelming firepower, and never made mistakes. They had destroyed hundreds of civilizations by being completely predictable and efficient. But the humans weren't following any rules the machines understood. They rammed ships when they should have maintained distance. They boarded enemy vessels when they should have stayed safely outside. They made jokes when they should have been coordinating tactical information. They treated the deadliest military machines in the galaxy like annoying bullies who needed to be taught a lesson. Sir Vextol's tactical officer said in amazement, "I think the humans are winning, but I have no idea how." The truth was, the humans were winning because they were doing something the harvesters had never encountered before. They were fighting with pure human stubbornness, creativity, and complete refusal to accept that some fights couldn't be won. When their weapons didn't work, they used their ships as weapons. When their ships were damaged, they got out and fought with hand tools. When nothing else worked, they just kept hitting things until they broke. And somehow, impossibly, it was working. Captain Rebecca Stone had seen plenty of horrible things during her 15 years in the Terran Defense Force, but nothing had prepared her for what she found inside the harvester processing facility. Her reconnaissance team had cut through 3 layers of mechanical defenses to reach the center of the massive alien structure, expecting to find weapon systems or command centers. Instead, they discovered something that made even these battle-hardened soldiers feel sick. The facility was filled with thousands of transparent tubes, each one containing a living being from a dozen different alien species. But these weren't prisoners waiting to be rescued. The creatures inside were still alive, but mechanical devices were slowly replacing their organic parts with cybernetic components. Wires ran from their heads into massive computer systems, while their thoughts and memories were being copied and stored in digital format. "Oh my God," whispered Private Danny Rodriguez, staring at a tube containing a Zephyrian child whose wooden arms were being replaced with mechanical appendages. "They're not killing them, they're turning them into machines." Stone activated her helmet camera and began recording everything she saw. In one section, she found beings who had been completely converted, their organic minds now running on computer processors while their bodies had become part of the facility's operating system. They were still conscious, still aware of what had happened to them, but they couldn't control their own actions anymore. "Admiral Morrison, this is Stone," she reported over the communication system, her voice tight with anger. "You need to see what we've found down here. These machines aren't just harvesting planets for raw materials. They're harvesting people for their minds." When the full horror of the discovery spread through the human fleet, something changed in the way they fought. Up until that moment, Many humans had treated the battle like a challenging military exercise, the kind of dangerous but exciting mission that soldiers sometimes looked forward to. They had been fighting to save the Zerg and stop an aggressive enemy. But they had still followed the basic rules of war. Now they realized they weren't fighting an enemy army. They were fighting something that committed crimes against the very idea of what it meant to be alive and free. Admiral Morrison's voice, when it came over the fleet communication system, was colder than anyone had ever heard it. All units, new mission parameters. We are not conducting a military operation anymore. This is an extermination mission. These machines have crossed every line that separates civilization from horror. Colonel Mark Thompson, who commanded the fleet's specialized weapons division, immediately began deploying equipment that had never been used in actual combat. His ships carried electromagnetic pulse weapons designed to destroy electronic systems by overloading them with massive electrical charges. But Thompson's team quickly modified these weapons to specifically target the artificial neural networks that allowed the Harvester Collective to think and communicate. If these things want to exist as a network, Thompson said grimly, then we'll cut every connection they have. Meanwhile, Lieutenant Chris Evans led a team of engineers who began the dangerous work of studying captured harvester technology to understand how the collective operated. Evans had always been fascinated by alien technology, but working with harvester systems felt like handling something poisonous. Every piece of equipment they examined contained traces of the organic minds that had been absorbed into the collective consciousness. It's like the entire machine civilization is built on slavery, Evans reported to his superior officers. Every computer system, every weapon, every ship contains thousands of enslaved minds that are forced to process information for the collective. The engineers worked around the clock to find ways to turn the Harvester's own technology against them. They discovered that the collective's greatest strength, its ability to instantly share information across vast distances, could become a weakness if they could inject the right kind of disruptive signals into the network. Human forces began using tactics that no military academy had ever taught. Entertainment systems from civilian ships were repurposed to broadcast confusing signals directly into Harvester communication networks. The machines, designed for perfect efficiency, couldn't handle random noise and conflicting information being pumped into their shared consciousness. Mining equipment that had been designed to break apart asteroids was modified to physically tear apart the processing centers where captured mines were being held. Industrial cutting beams that could slice through solid rock made short work of the mechanical systems that kept organic beings trapped in kinetic conversion chambers. Even more disturbing to the harvesters was the humans' complete unpredictability. The collective operated by analyzing enemy behavior and calculating optimal responses. But human tactics didn't follow any logical pattern. One moment they would use sophisticated electronic warfare, and the next moment they would resort to hitting things with hammers until they broke. Dr. Patricia Wells, a biologist who had been studying terraforming techniques, made a discovery that changed the entire battle. She realized that some of the biological agents used to prepare planets for human colonization were lethal to the organic components that the harvesters used in their computer systems. Their whole network depends on keeping those enslaved minds alive, Wells explained to Admiral Morrison. But if we can target the biological components with the right kind of agent, we can shut down their entire civilization without harming any of the prisoners. The systematic efficiency that had made the harvesters nearly unstoppable against other species became their greatest weakness when facing humans, who refused to fight by any recognizable rules. The machines calculated that humans should retreat when faced with superior firepower, but instead they attacked more aggressively. The collective predicted that humans would try to negotiate when they discovered the scope of harvester operations, but instead they became more determined to destroy every trace of the mechanical civilization. Most confusing of all, to the harvester collective was the human emotional response to discovering the processing centers. Other species had sometimes fought harder when they found evidence of harvester atrocities, but humans seemed to take the crimes personally, as if the enslaved aliens were members of their own families. The machines had never encountered a species that became more dangerous when they got angry, rather than less effective. And humans, it turned out, could get very angry indeed when they discovered that someone was turning living beings into computer parts. The final harvester's stronghold was hidden deep inside a massive asteroid that had been hollowed out and converted into a processing center the size of a small city. For 3 days, human forces had been systematically hunting down every last trace of the mechanical collective across multiple star systems, but this facility was different. It contained the central brain of the entire harvester network, the core processing unit that coordinated billions of machines across the galaxy. Captain Jennifer Hayes volunteered to lead the final assault, even though everyone knew it was essentially a suicide mission. The facility was protected by automated defense systems, booby traps, and the desperate last efforts of a dying artificial intelligence that had nothing left to lose. But Hayes had spent the last 72 hours watching her fellow humans free thousands of enslaved organic minds from harvester processing centers, and she wasn't about to let the main computer escape to rebuild somewhere else. "This is Hayes to all units," she announced as her team prepared to enter the asteroid facility. "We're going in to shut down the brain of this whole operation. If we don't make it out, make sure someone tells Earth that we finished the job." Her assault team consisted of volunteers from across the human fleet. Engineers who had never fired a weapon in combat worked alongside battle-hardened Marines. Scientists who normally studied peaceful subjects carried explosive charges designed to collapse the entire structure from within. Even civilian miners had joined the mission, bringing their expertise with demolition charges and their intimate knowledge of how to bring down massive underground structures. The team fought their way through corridors filled with disparate mechanical defenders. The Harvester Collective threw everything it had at them, from combat robots to environmental hazards like poison gas and electrical barriers. But the humans had learned something important over the past 3 days. The machines could be beaten by people who refused to give up, no matter how impossible the situation looked. "The central processor is just ahead," called out engineer Tony Walker, reading the blueprints they had captured from another harvester facility, "but it's protected by some kind of energy shield that our weapons can't penetrate." Hayes looked at the massive blast doors blocking their path and smiled grimly. "Good thing we brought mining charges instead of military weapons." The explosive charges that civilian miners used to break apart asteroids were far more powerful than anything the military normally carried. When they detonated inside the confined space of the asteroid facility, the entire structure began to collapse. But Hayes and her team had planned for this. They used the collapse itself as a weapon, bringing down millions of tons of rock directly onto the central processing unit. The last harvester transmission cut off in mid-sentence, and suddenly, the galaxy became a much quieter place. Across dozens of star systems, mechanical ships that had been terrorizing civilizations for centuries simply stopped working as their connection to the collective consciousness was severed forever. Admiral Morrison received the final report while standing on the observation deck of his flagship, looking out at the rescued Zephyrian homeworld. The planet's atmosphere was slowly returning to its natural color as giant atmospheric processors worked to repair the damage. Thousands of liberated prisoners from dozens of different species were being treated in temporary medical facilities that human engineers had built in just a few hours. Commander Vextel approached Morrison with a container that glowed with soft, blue light. Inside was enough crystallized time energy to power Earth's entire civilization for 1,000 years. The payment that had been promised in the original distress call, Admiral Vextel said formally, "The Zephyrian Coalition wishes to honor our agreement. This energy represents everything we have of value, but it cannot begin to repay the debt we owe your people." Morrison looked at the incredible treasure being offered to him, then gently pushed it back toward the alien commander. "Keep it," he said simply. "You're going to need that energy to rebuild your world and help all those people we rescued." Vexto stared at Morrison in shock. "But Admiral, your people have traveled across the galaxy, risked their lives, lost some of their finest soldiers. Surely you expect some compensation for your efforts." "We don't charge people for doing what's right," Morrison replied. "Besides, the real payment is knowing that all those enslaved minds are free again, and the galaxy doesn't have to worry about the harvesters anymore." As the human fleet prepared to return to Earth, something unprecedented was happening across the galaxy. Intelligence networks that had spent centuries cataloging different species and their threat levels were frantically rewriting their files on humanity. The beings from the small blue planet had gone from being classified as dangerous primitives from a death world to potential allies of immense strategic value. The Altarians, who had refused to help with the harvester crisis, suddenly found themselves wondering what other threats might be lurking in the galaxy that only humans would be crazy enough to fight. The crystal-based Vortians began calculating whether it might be worth establishing trade relations with a species that considered fighting extinction-level threats a moral duty rather than a business opportunity. Even the war-loving who had dismissed the Zephyrian situation as hopeless, started asking themselves whether they wanted to be friends or enemies with beings who treated impossible military situations as weekend entertainment. Commander Vextel spent his final day with the human fleet helping to coordinate the massive relief effort. He watched human medical teams working around the clock to treat alien injuries they had never seen before. He saw human engineers building temporary shelters for refugees using materials and techniques they were inventing on the spot. Most amazingly, he watched human soldiers playing games with alien children who had been rescued from harvester processing centers, helping them remember what it felt like to be free. In his final report to the Galactic Council, Vextel wrote words that would be remembered for generations. "The humans came not because we could pay them, not because they wanted our territory, not because they hoped to gain anything for themselves. They came because they heard strangers crying for help, and their nature would not allow them to ignore that cry. The galaxy has never seen anything like them, and we are all safer because they exist."